So you'll see with this data that in the landscape of different apps that exist in the ecosystem that you can buy on Google Play or in the App Store, games is kind of down there, right? It's still a significant, portion of apps. In fact, it's 105.6 million people who use mobile games every day, and that's 43% of the total U.S. market. But social and shopping is a larger category. But when you actually look at time spent, games is right up there. And what's interesting is it's not just the core gamers, but it's a lot of people that never played games before, and that's why casual games represent, in some ways, a huge market opportunity, but also a lot of challenges, and those challenges are what we're going to talk about today. So one of the main challenges that, as most of you probably know, and game developers specifically, is that while there's an enormous amount of time spent with games, there's also a lot of competition. And the positive is, because of the growth opportunity, a lot of console gamers or console manufacturers are getting into mobile games. But what's interesting is they're having to compete against other mobile game developers who are much smaller, the indies, for example. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as we have VR entering the picture, as Pokemon Go. We're actually looking at that data now, seeing what happens over the lifetime and seeing how long users stick around. The interesting thing also is that the revenue now is about $30 billion worldwide spent on mobile games, and active, consumers, their average purchase over the course of the year might be $35 or so, and 70% spend $25. These are in-app purchases and just purchases for games, and considering what it costs to purchase a game, that's kind of a lot of money. So one of the challenges that I just touched on was there's a lot of different games available. The market is extremely fragmented. So you see here that there's 77 mobile games that deliver 1 million users. But on the flip side, there's only a couple that deliver more than 10 million users. So you can see the challenge that anytime a game enters the App Store, it's free to almost either free or very low cost to sample. And so there's a lot of choice, and it's very hard for developers to maintain those users and maintain that retention over time. So in general, the appeal of mobile gaming, just kind of going back to what we're watching, which is console gamers ending, console manufacturers and developers, publishers entering the market. One of the compelling things is the low cost of entry, as well as the ease of access. So while a console game is typically tethered to a home device, a mobile game can be played just about anywhere, downloaded anywhere, downloaded anytime. And the initial cost to enter the market is quite low. So a console title might be $60, whereas a Minecraft Pocket Edition is $6.99. So the challenge that we have to look at, and why what the research we're doing is important, is looking at across the landscape what's happening. What are the most challenging factors that developers and publishers encounter? And there's a lot of analytics that you can get on your own game. The challenge is getting analytics and data across multiple games. So the previous speaker was just talking about what was working for them. Well, wouldn't it be interesting to see what was working for 10 other games like that? And that's what we are spending our time looking at. But you'll see here in this chart, the most challenging aspect is discoverability and then keeping them. So looking at the patterns of app discovery to download, again, the friction-free quality of games is the problematic part. It's relatively easy to find them because you have only a couple places to do it, and you can get them to download. It's the adoption part that becomes troublesome later. So here's a really complicated graph about the typical marketing challenge. So you can see here that most of the discovery happens within the App Store or Google Play. And then there's a fairly significant amount that's found where users discover games through social media, through search, through recommendations, through, hey, have you ever played this game? It can be that casual. And then after it's downloaded, just during the day after the download, they lose about half their audience, right? So it's 40 to 60% stay around. After about 30 days, there's only 10 to 20% of the initial users that are sticking around. And that's the problem that developers find themselves, where they're scratching their heads saying, well, what is my colleague doing that might be working? Or how could I better monetize? And you can see that the monetization factor here is really quite low. As we look at who these gamers are, because we've segmented them, you'll see that the heavy gamers are the ones that are the 3%, represent 3% of all spend. So the challenge here is, how do you retain them? How do you introduce new features? How do you get them to spend more money? And I'm not going to go into the details of a lot of games, but I happen to fit that demographic of a Candy Crush player. I've had it on my phone. It's easy to spend money on Candy Crush because you really are so frustrated. You just want, I got to get to this level. Games like that encourage people to spend more, and that's what we have to look at as publishers, is what is working. So one of the key things, hoping nobody's offended by this, but there's a gamer stereotype that a lot of, I don't think any of us here actually hold to this, although I do have someone in my household that kind of looks a little bit like this. But in a family, you might have someone like me who does play a lot of games and has been doing it for years. You have my husband will invest more time in console games. I have a 14-year-old who looks a little younger than this guy, but spends an inordinate amount of time on games, all sorts, all devices. And then a daughter who's like, yeah, if it's a beauty thing, I might play. So gamers are varied. And when you look at the demographics, these are just some simple stats. These are some of the top games that are out there, mobile games, but it's not exactly who you would expect. And for example, just to get specific, Candy Crush attracts a Gen X, a boomer audience. I am not a boomer, so please do not judge. But 75% of Candy Crush Saga players are 35 and older. So I wouldn't be in that, would I? And the Words with Friends are approximately 70% are adults 35 and over. So, and then Clash of Clans, which requires a larger investment, and maybe people who are used to playing games more, obviously 40% is 35 and older, not obviously, but 60% is younger than 35, and skews male. So as you start to go into who is playing games, you need to look at where do you want to spend your time as a developer? Who do you want to market to the most? And so what we did is we broke up the gamers into 3 different segments. So the chart's let me explain so out of 100%, the light gamers are the ones that are the samplers. They're downloading a couple games and then they move on, right? Heavy gamers represent 88% of all time spent, and within that you have core gamers, which are the top 20%, and there's a bit of overlap. That's why this graph is a little crazy, but 62% of all time spent with games are the core gamers, and those are the ones that we want to focus on because they're the ones who spend the most money and come back day after day. So this kind of quantifies it a little bit more. So an average gamer spends 24 minutes, but if you look at the core gamer, it's more than 4 times the average. So 1 hour and 40 minutes per day. Doesn't sound, I can see that. Light gamers, these are the samplers, just 2 minutes per day. So where do you focus your time? And then when you look at per day, per month, the average session time, the numbers get pretty. And the light gamers, again, are the samplers, and they're ones that you don't want to ignore these guys, but at the same time, you're probably not going to invest a lot of money in them because they probably won't come back. So in terms of discovery and downloads, so one of the things that we look at in our data is what are the optimal times to sort of get users and acquire them and get them to stay. And so what our research showed was that Tuesdays and Sundays are days where you'll see a lot of downloads, and Sundays specifically. Friday through Sunday is pretty good, but in terms of when you're going to promote, Sunday is a great day, and Tuesday is also a solid day. And interestingly enough, across the industry, Tuesday is the day when we typically launch movies or press releases go out. So for Tuesday, that's something to remember. There's other stuff going on in the industry. So knowing that Sunday is also a good day might be something important when you're thinking about getting more users to your game. In terms of Tuesday and Sunday, There are also peak times. Commute times are popular, as well as the prime time hours, which tend to be in the evening. These are also good times to acquire users. And in terms of, if you look at the app ecosystem, again, I've underscored the challenges, we all know them. But if you look at the retention rate, there are some things about mobile games that are actually better than most apps. And once you can get those users in, those core users, typically they'll stick around for a couple of months, which is better than most apps. You'll get them coming back day by day, day after day. You'll get a stickier user, and overall, these are where you want to spend your money and where you want to monetize. The samplers, by comparison, these are the ones that, again, will download your game, but they won't stick around. They'll download many other apps. So one of the things that we study, and when we look at apps and games, is the cohort analysis, which is, if I have a Candy Crush user, what other apps are they installing? What other apps are sticky for them? You can get that data through us, through how we analyze straight from the user, but also it's recommended that to do focus groups, understand what it takes to acquire them and what they like, what they're interested in, and then that will give you some good indications of better marketing strategies. So both the hard measurement data coupled with some of the qualitative data is really useful for developing your strategy. So managing customer churn, this is where everybody kind of goes, oh. I think everyone's probably fairly familiar with these metrics. High acquisition days, but after the first 2 weeks, this is what's happening. Now in this chart, we kind of profiled some really popular games, and Candy Crush is one that does pretty well. They keeps users. It's got a fairly flat. Once you have the initial drop off, it stays fairly consistent. Clash of Clans is another interesting one because if you're familiar with the game, it takes a lot more effort to get involved in the game, so you're likely to stick around longer. But Solitaire, you'll see a giant drop-off, and part of that is because there's a million Solitaire games out there. If you really don't like that experience, you're probably just going to move on. Now, in terms of once you get these users, looking at the heavy gamer cohort, so this blue line here, they're spending a ton of time. Like, these guys are where you should focus. They are the majority of your user. So what can you do from a product standpoint, a feature standpoint, to message them, to keep them involved, to try new things, to A/B test? This is where you should focus. And I did hear the previous speaker saying they didn't do a lot of segmentation. This is why we think that segmentation is so important, is you can't market to everybody. You can't spend money on everybody, so make some choices based on the data that you have. So this kind of gives you another lens of the time spent. So you can see again, some interesting figures here in terms of the time spent per month, right, in the sessions. Specifically, hold on, I'll get to that page. Yeah, so essentially Clash of Clans, again, we see kind of similar sort of investment figures, but the heavy gamers here are spending 332 sessions per month compared to an average player that's spending about doing about 110 sessions per month. And heavy gamers play Words with Friends, who play Words with Friends represent double the number of game sessions each month versus average users. So again, refining segmentation, looking for new features, looking for ways to reach those users is going to be critical to retaining them. So just to recap, I think the battle we face is there's a lot of competition. It's really pretty low cost to develop a game. It's pretty low cost to get it on an app store. And frankly, the great thing about it for consumers is there are a lot of choices. And the great thing for developers is the landscape's fairly democratized. So just because you're Nintendo doesn't mean that your game is going to be bigger than anybody else's. So size matters, reach matters, downloads matter, but engagement is the key, and that's where we have to focus. And then, in this category, we have to look at a marketing approach that takes into consideration who are the players. So a mixed exposure strategy between an app store and outside platforms, both from the discovery standpoint, like Are these players typically discovering us on search? Are they in the App Store repeated times? All of that analysis is really important. And then recognizing the unique behaviors for each game that you have, because if you produce multiple games, you're probably going to have different types of users, different demographics in those games. Not all one size fits all. It's not a one size fits all type of strategy. Just to underscore, and I've talked about the heavy gamers and the core gamers, but extreme sampling really is the norm. That's really what is happening. You've got people, it's super easy to download, and it's super easy to disappear and take that off your phone. And then finally, like the first 2 to 3 days are the most critical. That's really where you want to use your analytics to watch, but also be familiar with what's happening across the landscape with games like yours. Understand the cohorts, understand the overlaps. And finally, those who remain in your game are the ones that where you really want to focus. That's your primary user set, and that's where you want to spend the time developing a communication strategy. So the presentation I gave will be available through the Casual Connect site somehow after the show. But we just came out with a report yesterday. This is the URL here. Feel free to take a picture or go to our website. This is a lot of the same data, but it goes into a little bit more explanation and has some different slides. So this might be interesting if you want to understand the audience measurement perspective for the games market. Okay, great. That's it.